Do you ever think about breathing? Like, why do we breathe? Like, why doesn't the air just run out? Are we even real? I hate to say it, but this is a great question. How do we know that we're real? Well, according to psychology, wait. Oh, wait, guys, can we cut? Today we're actually talking about a much more essential process. Sorry, Freud. The carbon cycle is the process through which carbon cycles through organisms and the environment. And this is important because carbon is essential to life. Whether it be phospholipids in the membrane, DNA in the nucleus, or just glucose, we need carbon. And plants need it too. Now, the carbon cycle doesn't necessarily start anywhere unless we want to go back billions of years. So when the Earth was first created, don't do it. Thanks, thought bubble. Let's start our cycle in plants. Now, if I'm carbon, where am I going? Well, first of all, I'm CO2, a compound of carbon and oxygen found in the air, and the first thing on my to-do list is to enter the plant cell through the stomata. Along with light energy from the sun, carbon dioxide enters the chloroplast of plant cells. Within the thylakoid membrane, the light enters photosystem 2 and excites the electrons in there while H2O is oxidized, which, by the way, gives off O2 that might just be important. The concentration of ions initiates the electron transport chain within the thylakoid membrane. The now grounded electrons are transported to photosystem 1, which excites the electrons yet again. This reduces NADP+, the final electron acceptor, to make NADPH. Lastly, the electrons travel through the ATP synapse, which rotates to create none other than ATP. So what's going on with carbon? Carbon dioxide is in the stroma of the chloroplast, where the Calvin cycle will now occur. The Calvin cycle requires the NADH and ATP from the light reactions as energy inputs to fix CO2 into a reduced form. At the first step, one CO2 molecule is added to RUBP, creating a 6-carbon molecule product which quickly breaks down into 2 3-carbon molecules. It is catalyzed by the enzyme Rubisco. Next, the 3-PG is reduced to form glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, or G3P. This step requires both ATP and NADH. Most of the G3P ends up as RUMP, which utilizes ATP to convert into RUBP, which is regenerated. The rest of G3P is used to make sugar. So, we said organisms need carbon, but what's the importance of this? We just created C6H12O6. With the power of sun and the input of water, plants are able to make their own energy source, and this process is called photosynthesis. Let's take a look at the equation. Here's what we didn't consider. Where does the CO2 come from? Well, not to brag, but it does come from yours truly. And every other organism that breathes oxygen. When we breathe, we aid plants in photosynthesis. That's right, you can help a plant by just breathing. Also, it aids you in breathing and living. But I guess that's irrelevant. Thanks, thought bubble. Now, on to cellular respiration. Oxygen is converted into CO2 by a process known as cellular respiration. However, the more important aspect of cellular respiration is the fact that it harvests energy from food. The equation looks a little something like this. Cellular respiration begins with glucose entering the cytosol of the cell where no oxygen is needed. During the first step, glycolysis, glucose is converted into 3-carbon molecule of pyruvate and 2 NADH molecules and 4 ATP molecules are created. This process, however, requires the input of 2 ATP molecules, so the net gain of ATP is only 2 molecules. But hold on, we're about to get way more. The next step is pyruvate oxidation. Pyruvate oxidation occurs in the mitochondrial matrix where oxygen is present. Pyruvate is oxidized to 2 carbon acetate molecules and CO2. And we're done. The CO2 is exhaled and plants can live happily ever after. Except we're not done. Thanks, ATP. Hey, you wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for me. Uh-huh. The acetate molecule is bound to coenzyme A, which forms citrate, the starting molecule of the next process, the citric acid cycle. NAD+ is also reduced to NADH, which will be important for later. Citrate enters the citric acid cycle and is oxidized to create NADH and release more CO2. You're welcome, plants. This molecule is then oxidized again, yielding the same effect. At the next step, NAD+ and FAD+ are reduced and ATP is produced. This leaves us with OOA, which is recycled to complete the cycle again for the second molecule of pyruvate. The citric acid cycle operates twice for each glucose molecule. Finally, we're at the last step. Bring on the ATP. The NADH and FADH2 molecules that are reduced by the other steps of cellular respiration are finally put to use. In the electron transport chain, these molecules are oxidized, which builds up a concentration of H+ ions in the matrix. The ions are actively transported across the inner membrane, resulting in a gradient in the intermembrane space. These ions are diffused back across the membrane through the ATP synthase, creating ATP via chemiosmosis. This yields a lot of ATP. Lastly, H ions are accepted by O2, the final electron acceptor, making water. Let's take a look at the products of cellular respiration. As you can see, glycolysis requires an input of glucose and 2 ATP, but it yields 2 ATP and 2 NADH. Pyruvate oxidation yields 2 pyruvate, 2 NADH, and 2 CO2. When you combine this with the 4 CO2 of the citric acid cycle, we give off 6 CO2. The citric acid cycle also gives off 8 NADH, 2 FADH2, and 2 ATP. Lastly, from the ETC, the 12 NADH and 2 FADH2 from the other two steps goes into the ETC to yield 34 ATP, and our final total of ATP is 38 ATP. The CO2 that we exhale goes back to plants, who in turn give us O2, and not to mention their sweet, sweet carbs. This cycle between CO2 and O2 is essentially the basis of the carbon cycle, give or take a few factors. Essentially, the process looks something like this. We need plants, and they need us too, which is why our global impact matters. We should take into consideration our photosynthetic friends and the effect that we have on them. But for now, keep breathing and go out there and get that ATP.